One shot, fired by a man whose name we will never know. In the next 60 seconds, it will kill an empire's confidence and start a war that creates a new country. This isn't a story about generals. It's a story about farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had never fired a shot in anger, and who were about to face the most powerful army on Earth. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how 13 scattered colonies, who couldn't even agree with each other half the time, ended up standing on a village green at dawn, waiting. Let's go back to where it actually started. Not with a gun, with a bill. To understand why the colonies rose, you first have to understand the empire they rose against. By the 1760s, Britain had just emerged victorious from a brutal 9-year global conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War and in America as the French and Indian War. Britain had fought France for control of North America, and Britain had won. French territory in Canada fell into British hands. The map of the continent had been redrawn in London's favor. It should have been a moment of pure triumph, and in many ways it was. But victory had a price tag. 9 years of warfare, fought on multiple continents, funded by loans, supplied by an overstretched treasury, had buried the British government in debt. Historians estimate Britain's national debt roughly doubled over the course of the war. Someone was going to have to pay for it. And when British officials looked for someone to help cover that bill, their eyes drifted 3,000 miles west, to 13 colonies that had grown steadily wealthier throughout the war, and that had, in London's view, benefited enormously from British protection. To Parliament, the logic seemed airtight. British soldiers had defended colonial land. British ships had protected colonial trade routes. The war itself had been fought, in large part, to secure the colony's western frontier from French and Native American resistance. So why, London reasoned, shouldn't the colonies help pay for their own defense? But 3,000 miles away, the colonists told a very different story. Many of them had fought in that war themselves. Colonial militias had marched alongside British regulars. Colonial farms had been raided, colonial families displaced, colonial trade disrupted for the better part of a decade. Many colonists felt they had already paid, in blood, in disrupted lives, in the ordinary cost of surviving a war fought partly on their own soil. Neither side believed it was being unreasonable. And that, more than any single law or tax, is what made the years ahead so dangerous. 2 governments, one in London, one scattered across 13 colonial assemblies, each convinced of its own fairness, each blind to how the other side saw the world. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a tax requiring colonists to purchase specially stamped paper for almost every printed document imaginable. Newspapers, legal contracts, playing cards, even marriage licenses. On paper, it looked like an ordinary revenue measure, the kind Parliament had passed inside Britain itself for generations. But in the colonies, it landed very differently. Because unlike British subjects living in England, the American colonists had no representatives in Parliament. No colonial delegate sat in the House of Commons. No colonial voice had been consulted before the tax was written into law. A simple phrase began circulating through taverns and print shops up and down the coast: taxation without representation. It was a legal argument, but it was also something more, a question about identity. Were the colonists full British subjects, entitled to the same rights as anyone in London? Or were they something lesser? A source of revenue, governed but not consulted. The Stamp Act provoked such fierce resistance, boycotts, riots, organized protest by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, that Parliament repealed it within a year. It seemed for a moment like the crisis had passed, but Parliament had not abandoned the underlying idea. In 1767, a new set of laws arrived, the Townshend Acts, placing taxes on glass, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. Once again, the colonists organized boycotts. Once again, tension rose, and in 1770, that tension turned violent. What happened next in Boston wasn't planned by anyone, not the soldiers, not the crowd. But 5 men were about to die, and the colonies were about to get their first martyrs. In Boston, a confrontation between British soldiers and an angry colonial crowd ended in gunfire. 5 colonists were killed. Colonial newspapers quickly named the event the Boston Massacre, printing engravings of the shooting that spread across the colonies within weeks, some more dramatic than the facts strictly supported, but devastatingly effective all the same. To London, it was a tragic breakdown of order, a small skirmish blown out of proportion. To many colonists, it was proof of something darker, that British soldiers stationed on American soil could turn their weapons on the very people they claimed to protect. For a few years, an uneasy quiet settled over the colonies. Most of the Townshend taxes were repealed. Only one remained in place, a small tax on tea, kept less for the revenue it raised than as a symbol, a reminder that Parliament still held the right to tax the colonies whenever it chose. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, a law that let the struggling East India Company sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price than colonial merchants could match, while still collecting that same symbolic tax. To London, it looked like a simple piece of economic policy, even something of a bargain for colonial tea drinkers. To the colonists, it looked like something else entirely, a trap. Accept the cheap tea, and they would be quietly accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. The price of the tea was never really the issue, the principle behind it was. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, some disguised, deliberately obscuring their identities, boarded 3 British tea ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Over the course of a few hours, they broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped every pound of it into the water. No one was hurt, nothing was stolen. It was a targeted act of protest, not a riot, but its message could not have been louder. London's response wasn't going to be a warning. It was going to be a punishment designed to make an example out of an entire colony. And it would backfire in a way nobody in Parliament saw coming. Parliament's response was swift, and it was harsh. In 1774, lawmakers passed a series of punitive measures the colonists would come to call the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed to trade until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts's colonial government was placed under tighter royal control. British troops were to be quartered in colonial homes if local officials demanded it. The message from London was unmistakable: defiance would be punished, and Massachusetts, the epicenter of resistance, would serve as the example. But punishment did not produce obedience. It produced solidarity. There was no internet in 1774, no telegraph, no newspaper wire service delivering the news instantly from colony to colony. But ideas still traveled, carried by letters, by printed pamphlets, by travelers moving from town to town, and by a growing network the colonists themselves had built: the Committees of Correspondence. These committees, ordinary colonists organized town by town, colony by colony, existed for one purpose: to share information. What Parliament had done to Massachusetts today, it might do to Virginia or Pennsylvania tomorrow. The closing of Boston Harbor was not just Boston's problem. It was everyone's warning. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for what would become known as the First Continental Congress. They were not yet calling for independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. But they agreed to something remarkable for colonies that had spent a century squabbling over borders and trade: a coordinated boycott of British goods and a shared commitment to resist the Intolerable Acts together. For the first time, 13 separate colonies had begun to act, however cautiously, as one. And in the towns themselves, something was shifting too. Taverns that had once been simple places to eat and drink became something more. Informal newsrooms, debate halls, and increasingly meeting places for local militia companies, quietly preparing for the possibility that talk alone would not be enough. One conversation inspired another. One town's resistance inspired the next. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts specifically, colonists had begun stockpiling gunpowder, muskets, and cannon in towns outside British-controlled Boston, Concord among them. It was preparation, not provocation, they told themselves. But to British commanders watching from Boston, it looked like something else: the early machinery of an armed rebellion.